This is Authorhood with Sarah Reed and Jessica Payne. All right.
Hi, everyone. If you are not on YouTube, you can't see Sarah's gigantic glass of wine, but I'm a little jealous. And if you're listening on the podcast, just a reminder, we have a YouTube channel. So if you want to see our smiling faces, you can. Welcome to Authorhood, formerly Moms Writers Club, but we are still doing all the Moms Writers Club stuff. We are just expanding our audience a little bit. But welcome. Today, we are going to chat about books as art versus product, and writing what you want versus what maybe people tell you you should be writing. I'm Jessica.
And I'm Sarah.
And welcome to our episode. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that Moms Writers Club chat is still happening. It's over on Bluesky, and Tracy and Shay are hosting it. If you want to find them, I believe I've linked through my website. It's jessicapayne.net. And we have a great email list to get a reminder about when we're doing those, which is every other Wednesday still. Anyway, moving on with our little intro, Sarah, what have you been up to with your writing lately?
I had this awesome experience last night where it was funny. I took a picture of it. I should send it to you. Where I basically I like to write in bed. I have this adjustable bed so I can kind of put the head up, and I have a bad back, so it's great not to be in a chair. And I wound up in my bed with my lap desk and my laptop and 3 craft books and my little e-ink writing thing, the Remarkable tablet, all piled on top of me in my bed. It was really funny.
And someone came in and took a photo of this?
Well, I managed to
you had the best selfie ever.
Take a photo because I just thought it was so funny. I was buried in all my writing crap. But I just things started clicking into place with this new book I'm starting. And it was just this idea that I had that was just kind of they're like puzzle pieces. I had this idea and it was a cool puzzle piece, but as I was putting things together last night, I was like, oh, that's where that goes, and
Right.
It was super cool. And my sister is here visiting, and she is my best sort of book consultant, non-writer book consultant. And so I've been she's the one where I'm like, okay, so I think what happens is blah, de, blah, de, blah. And I tell her the whole story of my book, and I get to hear myself say it out loud and tell the story out loud, which often
helps so much.
It helps so much. It reveals the parts where I'm like, okay, I don't really know what happens there. And she's the perfect person because she's like, okay, that's fine, whatever. We'll just figure that out. Judgment-free zone, super, super nice.
Sarah knows this, but she's my person for that. We were talking
Jess is also very much my person for that.
Oh, that's true. But we were talking before we started filming, and I was like, gosh, it's so nice that you have your sister for that, because sometimes I try to talk to my husband. He'll be like, how was your day? And I was like, oh my God, let me tell you about this book I'm writing. And he'll listen attentively, but he's not like, oh, that's a great idea. What if you did this? He's more like, kind of weird. In all fairness, my last book was called Never Trust the Husband. I think he's still a little upset last night. So my daughter is 6. And she has started writing books as she'll illustrate them. She loves reading graphic novels. So she's been trying to write her own graphic novel. But her most recent thing is that she's writing a book called Never Trust the Wife, which my husband's so pleased about. He laughed really hard when he learned that.
Oh my God. That's hysterical.
Yeah.
Your daughter is 6 and she's writing a companion piece.
Yeah.
To your psychological thriller.
I love it.
Awesome.
But yeah, I hit 33K on my book 2 earlier today, so that's exciting. It's these books are a little shorter, so I'm aiming for 70 to 75K, so I'm approaching the midpoint, which I really feel once I hit the midpoint, I really know what the rest of the book needs to look like. Knock on wood, because I've said that and I'm like, oh, do I? But I feel that is getting over this bump. I usually feel hitting 40,000 words is a moment for me. I don't know why it's 40,000, but
the second half of a book writes so much faster for me
Yeah.
than the
Yes.
first quarter. If I can get the first 20,000 words, like, okay, this is solid. This is the real first 20,000 words, then
Yeah.
oh, the rest of it is so much easier.
You know what I find I struggle with is fun and games. And that should be like such an easy part, you think, because, it's the delivery of the premise. It's like the delivering on the promise of the premise. So it
Mhm.
should be like in some ways, it feels like it should be the easiest part, but actually coming up with those scenes, it's so much easier to know what the inciting incident is and the one-third twist and the halfway
Mhm.
turn and all that stuff in between. It's like, wait, I have to write that. Anyway, okay, so jumping into our topic, Sarah and I often discuss where a book falls. Is it art? Is it a product meant to be sold? And of course, it's actually a little bit of both because it's certainly an art form. But at the same time, like we keep trying to sell our books, and that in a way makes them a product. And I think Sarah and I are similar, but a little bit different on how we view our writing. And I certainly met people that fall on the far spectrum of either side. So yeah, do you want to get us started?
It's interesting to me because even if you are even if you are way over on the book as art end of the spectrum, a book by its nature is meant to be duplicated and replicated and sold to more than one person. So my stepdaughter is like a fine artist, is an oil painter, and she paints these incredible paintings, and she paints one, and she sells it for a fuck ton of money to one person. That's like, I mean, she does make prints of some of her stuff, but her main thing is to like paint a beautiful painting and sell it for a lot of money to one person. And that's the model, right? But books are not like that, you know? So even if you are very much the book as art kind of writer, you're still going to be replicating them and selling them to a marketplace of
Yeah.
individuals, you know?
Yeah. Hopefully a lot of people. And also you have to not that we always think about this, we probably should think about this, but finding your readership, because that's kind of like when a business is finding its customers in a way.
So it's like it just by its very nature, the the market comes into this picture, even if you're all the way over on the book as art end of things. Which we aren't, we are very much in the middle of this spectrum, in our different places.
So if I had to say like art was on the if you're on the podcast, you can't see my hands. They're spread apart and is on one side and product is on the other side. I think I'm like pretty firmly in the middle. I really like the idea of finding an in between. And the way I do that is I consider the things that I'm interested in writing and that will make me happy to write and that I will feel really strongly about and passionately about. And then of all of those things, I consider what is selling well in the market right now and what the market, is looking toward. For example, like the book that I just sold, Somebody Worth Killing, is a book about a woman who was a hit woman and also a mom and a wife. And that's a book that I really wanted to write something similar to about 5 years ago. And it was not working in the market at the time. I actually did write one and it didn't sell. So this is very different than what I wrote then, but it has that similar premise. And so knowing that the market had come around, it was the perfect time to, I actually stopped. I was writing a different book and I stopped as soon as I finished that draft and I did not revise that book, which I've never done this before, so that I could write the proposal and like the first 50 pages to send out for this book because I felt like, looking at the market and talking to my agent, it seemed like the right time. So I think that a good in between is possible where you are writing something that you want to be writing, but also something that will hopefully sell well. I also think that there are exceptions. I think about some very popular authors who, to some extent, can like dictate the market, or people will read literally anything with their name on it.
Right.
And
Well, it's
but
like
I
the
think
rules don't apply to
so
those.
exactly. And that's what I was
You
going to say.
know?
I think for the majority of us that doesn't work though. And that if you are going to choose to write something that is not super marketable, at least like kind of be aware that you're doing it, I think. And sometimes people do that. Sometimes like, you know what? I know, but this is the book I have to write. And sometimes they start that trend, and that is awesome. I don't feel that brave right now because I really like making money. But but I also admire that.
Yeah. This conversation is different when you're writing your first book, or maybe
Mhm.
your first book that you're going to query, versus when you're on your fourth or fifth book, you know?
Why do you think that? Can you explain?
Um, you know how your first book is kind of like the book of your heart, you know, that people talk about. Well, so for me anyway, when I was writing my first book, I was like, I must write this book. This character is like speaking to me. You know, this is the book I'm going to write, and I'm going to keep writing it until I get it right. And I was not thinking about marketability. I was thinking about writing the book that I wanted to read, and I was thinking about trying to learn how to write a book. However, now that I've written a couple, I feel like my skills are much better. I have more of a sense that, oh, I could write that, and I could write that, and I could write something
Mhm.
else, you know? And I could enjoy it. I could enjoy all those things. And I'm interested in, it's not like I have six book ideas in my head, but I have lots of thematic stuff that I'd love to play with at some point in a book, you know? So I feel like I have more range and flexibility now. Because you know what you're talking about and what you have talked about in the past is like this marriage between things that you would enjoy writing about, that you want to write about, and things that are, you know, selling well right now. And it's like if you can match those two things up, then
Mhm.
there you go. You know, you're
Yeah.
not talking about like writing a marketable book that you don't want to write. It's like those two elements meeting in the middle. And I feel like that was not probably possible for me when I was writing my first book.
I agree, and I think it's not just skill because I often think we gain the
Mm.
skill we need to write a book when we figure out how to write that book. Like I
Yeah.
remember, trying to write dual point of view for the first time and it was so scary, but I figured it out, in the book I did that with. But I think also it's a little bit of an awareness. I tried to be very aware of what the market was like when I was new, but I feel like there's so much to learn and figure out when you're just getting started, when you're writing those first books, when you're sending the query letters, that often it's kind of like you can't do both things at once. And some of it is also having the resources to figure out what is selling well, whether that's an
Right.
agent,
Right.
just
Hmm.
straight up be like, hey, what are editors looking for? Or watching the trends, like going on, which if you are new, here are some great ways to maybe get some insight into it. Publishers Marketplace, you can see what's currently selling, what editors are currently buying. At times, some agents will post on social media, like with what they're looking for in their query inbox. And that often, some of it's like personal preference, but sometimes it's reflective, especially when they get really specific. I always wonder, sometimes it's reflective of what they are hearing from editors. So I think a growing awareness of what is doing well in the market.
When we say in the market, we don't mean what is selling well in bookstores right now.
Mhm.
We are talking about a point much earlier in the publishing process. I mean, you've
Yeah.
heard us say it, you've heard a lot of people say it, that, you know, what's selling well in bookstores right now was acquired like 2 years ago. You know, and editors at publishing houses may be onto something completely different now. So I think you're really right on about like having access to that information of what is selling well from authors to editors right now rather than from bookstores to readers.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't think, I mean, unless you have an agent to talk to, it's, you know, you can see on Publishers Marketplace, but those are sales that have already gone through and might be several months old already because announcements often
Yeah.
take a while to come out. So yeah, I feel like you don't have as good access to that information.
Yeah. The other place you can look is manuscript wishlist. And I don't remember if it's MSWL.com or manuscript wishlist. Sorry, there are two different sites and they're related, but
Yeah.
they're separate. And one of them would pull from Twitter, which is
Mhm.
now X. So I actually don't know what's going on with that website now, if they're still even active, since I mean, some people are still on Twitter, but a lot of publishing has left. But you can also look on there. It's hard because you don't always know when it was last updated.
Manuscript Wish List or Manuscript Academy does, what do they call it? Like they used to call it 10 minutes with an expert or something like that. Anyway,
Oh, yeah.
they
They do.
coordinate like consultations with agents. So if you're unagented, you can go on there and you can spend like 30 or $40 or
It's
something.
more than that. It's
Is
pretty
it?
expensive. Yeah, because the way you usually do it is you buy like a monthly membership and it includes that meeting. I want to say it's like 60 or $70 a month. It's not cheap if you don't have a writing income to pay for it with.
Yeah. But if it's information that you really want and you really want it current, that could be doable.
Yeah, I would definitely make sure that agent represents what you are interested
Yeah.
in writing.
Yeah. Select carefully.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, then once you are agented or have an editor even at a publisher, then it's sort of, oh, what's the metaphor I'm looking for? It's like a blessing and a curse, where
Oh, let's get into that, shall we?
let's get into that.
Um,
Where so your agent or your editor may have a very clear idea of what they think is selling or what they think is marketable and like what they really want to see and what your editor really wants to acquire or what your agent really wants to, sell or whatever.
well, I was gonna say it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think sometimes people run into trouble with it when they feel like they need to write something that isn't what they want to write, which I don't think anybody should ever do. For example, at my last publisher, I sent a synopsis to my editor to get feedback. And some of her feedback was really helpful. And other feedback, like on one particular book, I didn't agree with. So I had to decide whether it was right for me and right for my book, or if it was something that I needed to just choose to not do. And my editor was, very understanding and got that that's not what I wanted to do, and it was fine. But I could see situations where it might not be that way, or sometimes. One thing I love doing is when I'm getting ready to write a new book, if I have several different book ideas, I will send them to my agent and we'll talk them over. And it's nice because she can give me the perspective of someone who's talking to those editors and be like, well, I know editors are looking for more, like XYZ than ABC or whatever.
Right.
And that can help guide me in what I choose to write next. So I find it very helpful, but I could also see where it could be frustrating if you're really wanting to write a specific thing. Like I've been writing psychological thrillers this whole time and they're not selling super well right now. So kind of, finding that out meant we talk about this in a different episode, but deciding if I'm going to pivot, which I did do like a slight pivot to be able to continue writing in the thriller space.
So the blessing part of it is that sort of like I feel like that sort of general guidance that you get from your agent, like, yeah, if you're going to lean in a different direction, like let's lean in this direction because I think that's where things are going, or like you throw several ideas out there and they're like, oh, this one and this one I think are your best bet. Sometimes agents and editors, and I have specifically heard this like with people working with editors, is that it's not sort of general guidance about sort of which direction to go. It's more like, oh, we want this kind of subplot in your
More
book.
prescriptive than like
Prescriptive. Yeah, like this is what we want you to write.
so in one of my books, I added a past point of view. It is actually in the Lucky One. So if you read the Lucky One, it's about a woman who escapes her would-be serial killer, only to find out, a decade later, maybe she hasn't actually gotten away after all. And that book originally did not have a past point of view in it. But now it does. Now there's 10 to 15,000 words
Yeah,
of flashbacks. And I think the book is that much better for it. I feel like
yeah.
you get a better sense of character and I think it builds tension. But that was a suggestion from my agent and it made the book so much better. So a lot of the times it can be a good thing. The key, I think, is to thinking about if it resonates with you and feels right for your story. And it's hard because these people are publishing professionals. And one of the reasons you have an agent and an editor is so that they can give you that feedback to make your book better. But it's really hard to know at what point it no longer feels like what you're doing is a thing that matches for your book. You
Yeah.
know, you don't want to be like, you're wrong. I don't want to take your advice, but you also want it to ring true for your own book. And I think it's hard to kind of know where that line is. And I think it's something that changes over time. And as you grow as an author, you kind of figure out. Like I remember the first time I said no to an edit, like pretty like specifically, it was just like, no, I'm not doing that. And it was a little scary. And it was fine. Everything was fine. The book's still published. I think it's great as it is. Now that it's been a few years, I look back on that suggestion and I'm like, oh, I see why they suggested that. Not because I think it would have made it a better book. It would have made it a little bit different of a
Mhm.
book. And better understanding the genre, I can kind of see why they made that suggestion.
Mhm. I get the question fairly often, like, how much did they make you change your book?
Yes, they
Like
assume
when
people
you,
are villains and they're making you change your book.
and it assumes that one person has all the control, which you sort of, which they sort of do. Like, but I don't know. Tell me what you think about this. I mean, like, there's this sort of idea that when you get into traditional publishing, the publisher has all the control. And if they tell you to do something, then, they are the gatekeeper. Like they hold the reins of this whole process versus the sense that like you're both professionals and they can want something that you can decline to.
Yeah. I've never felt like they have all that my publisher or my editor has all the power and that I have to do what they say. And I actually think so I listen to a lot of self-publishing podcasts. I find it really interesting. I find self-publishing authors to be some of the best marketers and publicists for themselves.
Yeah,
And I think there's so
totally.
much to learn from them. And at some point I'd like to self-publish something. So I like to soak it all in. But occasionally I come across a podcast that will talk about how horrible trad pub is. And and I am sure this has actually happened at some point. So it's not that I'm saying it's never happened, but this is not the norm. Like I have never like the podcast I heard was basically saying that traditionally published authors have zero control at all. And that is just not true.
Yeah.
It is not true at all. I have never felt like I had to do everything that was, quote unquote, suggested to me. I've never felt like I had to change my book to be exactly what someone else wanted it to be. And again, in fact, I've said no before, and the book is published, it's on my shelf. I think good editors try to guide you, but also respect that you know your book best and that you know what you want to be and it's your name on the cover. So I don't feel that way at all. I mean, and every publisher is different. Like my last publisher was Book Auteur. They're an imprint of Hachette. But they primarily focus on digital books and they do not quick release like 3 books in a month, but like they would publish me every 4 months if I could write and edit a book that fast, which I don't want to do that. But they do have more, it's written into the contract that they have a little more control. Like they only give you the one cover and usually changes can't be made, at least not significant ones. You usually are assigned your audiobook narrator. You don't get a choice of 3 or 4 to choose from. So there are some differences, but there are also upsides to that. Like one time we changed the prologue after the book published because we realized the prologue was when people stopped reading the book. So we fixed it so people
Yeah.
could keep reading the book. So
And you can do
I don't
that with
know.
the digital, with
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
It's primarily in digital. Yeah.
But I've never felt that way. Have you?
No. My first book, my editor suggested that I put in significantly more backstory, so I added about 5K of backstory, which made it a much better book. Like
Mhm.
even one of my beta readers who had already read it and loved it, read it when it came out and was like, "Oh, I didn't like think it needed anything, but like now that I see it with this backstory, it's better." That was a moment of building trust with my editor. I wonder how much of it is tied to personality, like
Of whom?
I of of the author. maybe of the editor too, but like your comfort with saying no.
I think it's definitely that sometimes, but I don't think it's that all the time.
No,
Um,
not all the time. But I mean, I guess what I'm saying is it behooves you to become comfortable saying no to things
yeah.
because people will take no for an answer, you know? And I guess ultimately, if you don't want to go the direction that the editor or the agent is encouraging you to go and you come to an impasse, I mean, you have the ultimate control of saying, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to write the thing, and then accepting whatever the consequences of that might be. They turn
Yeah.
down your option. You get out of your contract for your second book. You part ways with your agent, like whatever. I mean, ultimately, like that sucks. You don't want that, but the control is still in your hands.
And I do think it's good to consider all suggested revisions. It's just good to also be willing to say no.
Yeah. And I also ran into the situation with my second book where my editor made some comments and I recognized them as like, oh, I didn't get across what I was trying to get across here. Like I saw the way she read it and she had a suggestion for how to change it. But I was like, oh, no, no, no. Like I'm going to change it in this other way.
Yeah, but it like got the desired effect
It
completed,
totally
right?
did. And in fact, got more of the desired effect because obviously the way I had written it the first time didn't achieve what I was trying to achieve.
Yeah.
So I was like, no, I'm going to fix it, but I'm not going to fix it your way. I'm going to fix it my way.
Let's talk a little bit about when you are writing the next book, and because you and I have both experienced this, and um so typically when you're writing the second book on a contract, you send your editor a synopsis of what you might even start earlier than that. So you might send them a general premise, and then if they like the idea, you can send them like a whole synopsis, because
Right.
usually you need them to like give you the thumbs up. But it's pretty normal that your book changes from that initial synopsis. Like, for example, I'm writing book 2 right now, and already, like, just the order of scenes have changed, because when you actually lay it out, it's like, okay, I can see now that that scene needs to come first for the next one to like really make sense, or for the twist to not be spoiled. And that's okay. That's normal. I think that most editors are pretty used to that. But it is hard when you're telling someone what you're going to write about, and halfway through you're like, "Oh, maybe that's not what I'm writing about after all." Not to mention any names, Sarah.
That would be me. That would totally be me. I know. So I was thinking earlier, like your writing process has a lot of influence on this whole like writing what you want versus what other people expect you to write or want you to write or think will sell or whatever. So I am in this situation where I'm at the point where I'm going to go out on sub with whatever my next book is. And actually, my agent has my manuscript of my last book that I'm hoping will go on sub. I'm waiting very anxiously to hear from her. Anyway, so I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm not under contract. I'm just writing something that hopefully my agent will think is sellable and she'll sell and it'll all go great. So, I got on a conference call with her and was like, we were talking through an idea that I had. And I was like, here's my idea, blah, 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 blah. And she was like, okay, I think that'll work if you approach it like blah, 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 blah. And you were like, great, okay, off we go. And then in the course of my ridiculous process, it has become a very different book than I may have described to her. And I am very excited about it. And I'm like, this is the book I want to write. Oh my God, this is going to be great. This is so much fun, but it's not totally different, but it's pretty different.
Yeah.
So,
And that's where it's hard, coming back to talking about it as like a book as art versus a product. The reality is like, unless you're someone who's like literally just writing an outline and doing exactly what you think will sell, even if you are trying to write something that your agent has said, yeah, that sounds good, I think I can sell that. When it gets right down to it, it's an art, and it doesn't always go the way you plan it going. And your characters sometimes do things that you told them not to do, and they did it anyway. I know, which sounds a little ridiculous, but it happens.
Well, that was another thing I was thinking when we were thinking about this topic. I was thinking
Yes.
like publishing is all about the premise. I don't know if it's always been like this, but it feels very much like this now. They're like, what's the premise? Do you have a great pitch? Like, can you put it in one sentence? Are you high concept?
So I was reading John Truby's book, The Anatomy of Story. If you're on our podcast, you're
Yeah.
not seeing the cover, but it's a good book. I haven't read the whole thing through, but it's
You
funny
won't read the whole
because
thing through.
yeah,
It's like the first 5 chapters are great.
well, I'm using it kind of like whatever I feel like learning more about. I just read that one chapter.
Mhm.
And there's a chapter that's later than the first 5 chapters that I'm
Oh,
curious to check out, but I will let you know if it was not worth my time. He gets very detailed, which some people really love. For me, it's a little too much, and I just get distracted.
I bought
But
that book and I like tried to read it and then I just left it on my shelf for like 2 years. And then I came back to it. I was like, oh, I get it
it's
now.
really interesting. Okay, we're going down like a little sidetrack here. We'll come
Oh, rabbit hole.
back. Okay. Yeah, but I have found that with so many craft books is that I'll buy them and like be like, well, this is okay. And then 2 or 3 years later, I'll pick it up when I've like advanced my craft and I will read it. Like I was reading this last night while my child was doing her sport of choice. And I was like, oh, now I understand what he was talking about because, you get to be a better
Yeah.
informed, more aware author. And anyway, I was reading the part about premise because I'm currently working on pitches for what I'm going to do next. And he specifically talks about, and I'm curious if the reason publishing is so obsessed with the idea of like a high concept pitch or like a really perfect premise is because of Hollywood. Because he talks about how Hollywood sees it. Because they're like,
Mhm.
the basic idea of what he said is that they want to get people to the theater to watch movies in the theater, given this was written like when more people were regularly going to the movie theater. But and a single line pitch does that. Like it gets you excited. You don't have to think too hard about it. And yeah, it seems like that has transferred over to books. And I would be curious to know if that is something that has changed over the last 50 years or
Yeah.
if it's kind of always been like that. And I have no idea. I think about some of the older books I've read and I'm like, you'd need like 3 paragraphs to describe what that book is about. There is no high concept pitch that could cover it.
We are so content saturated right now,
Yeah.
too. My husband has been a musician his entire career, which has been like 50 years. And, so he was doing music in like the 70s, and that is very different from doing music now.
Oh, I can't
And,
imagine. It's like a whole
and
different business.
largely because we are drowning in content right now. And it takes more, like the barrier to entry is very low for putting out content of any kind. All you need is an internet connection, basically. You don't need a 2-inch tape recorder. You don't need the millions of dollars of studio equipment that you used to need to make a record. But now we are so saturated in content that I do think that it takes more to like break through the noise. And I think that's maybe what the high concept pitch is all about, is like breaking through the noise of all the content that we're constantly surrounded by and attracted by. And the whole reason I was thinking about like why publishing is obsessed with the premise is that like you can come up with a great premise, but and this is something Truby talks about in his book, that the problem with the high concept premise is that it's only 2 or 3 scenes in the movie. And you have to make an entire movie to support that premise. And the same is true, if not more so, for a book. I can say it's about a jailbreak in space, but that only accounts for like the big twist or it's a very small bit of the book that the premise describes. And it is incumbent on the author to write the whole fucking book.
Yeah, I really like the way
No?
he said it. He says pretty much what Oh, shoot, I just lost my page. Of course I did. But he basically says that, yeah, the premise is so important, but it only makes up 2 or 3 chapters or 2 or 3 scenes or whatever. And he
Yeah.
doesn't say that it's a problem. He does say they also don't know the inherent structural weakness found in any high concept premise that only gives you 2 or 3 scenes. These are the scenes just before and after the twist that make your premise unique. Only by knowing the full craft of storytelling can you overcome the limitations of the high concept and tell the whole story successfully. So anyway,
Yeah.
the point is just that we've all read a book or seen a movie that had a great premise and the rest of it just fell flat for us. So yeah, a high concept pitch is great and wonderful and very much in many areas of publishing necessary, but that can't be it. Like you still have to be willing to and want to write that whole book.
And I guess my point being that like an agent or an editor can say, "Oh, I want such and such a thing," but it's an entirely different thing to write an entire novel that works. That
That and you want to make it your own. Like I knew that they were looking for books on female assassins, and I was like, I want her to be a mom. That would be hilarious. Not because it's funny because she's a mom, but because it's like, oh shit, the babysitter's late and I have to kill this guy by midnight. Like, like that was like my first thought. I was just like, that would be such a fun book to write. So being able to take it and make it your own.
that's like the perfect example
Yeah.
of when that kind of thing really works.
I think we've said everything we had to say and maybe a little more. We
Yeah.
are long-winded as usual, but that's kind of our thing, I guess. So we'll wrap up there, but thanks for listening. And if you have any topic suggestions you'd like to hear us chat about, either in the world of publishing, or I guess we're willing to do some like craft too. We've done a lot of craft on our YouTube channel, Moms Writers Club YouTube channel. So if there's anything specific you're looking for, check it out. But yeah, I think that's everything for today. So thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Bye bye.
Bye.